2016 called and it wants its resolution back, which was apparently 1080p. NVIDIA, a company that previously paid influencers to make videos about 8K gaming on 3090 cards, is now marketing its new $400 RTX 4060 for 1080p. Great. The RTX 4060 Ti 8GB is one of the worst GPU launches from NVIDIA that we've ever covered, and we don't want to waste anyone's time here. So here's how it scales. It's anywhere from negatively scaled against the 3060 Ti or effectively equal once you sort of normalize for error, which is a really bad place to be, up to maybe 19 or 20% at the very best. And that is scaling the range of 1080p to 4K. There's a reason NVIDIA wants to focus on 1080p here. We tested all the games that we usually test at 1080, 1440, and 4K, and as the resolution increases, the performance falls off a cliff and plummets into oblivion. So deeply into oblivion, we were waiting for the Imperial Guard to show up.
Stop right there, criminal scum! Nobody breaks the law on my watch!
The launch is just straight up bad. It's that simple. And we covered in our news video how NVIDIA went short with the bus width for the memory interface and how the memory bandwidth is reduced. We presented their defenses in that news video, talking about how they say it's all about the extra cache making up for that change. And while that may be true in some instances, realistically, it didn't matter. So we get to test their claims today. We brought you this video with store.gamersnexus.net and our 15-year anniversary limited foil shirt. We expect to run out within the next week and will not be making another run of these. Our goal is to bring more journalism to PC hardware, and that's funded largely by our audience, and this year has been bigger than ever for that. Our 15-year shirt has supported many of our recent efforts, such as the introduction of the Gamers.Nexus hardware failure list. The front features a vibrant, bright blue foil mixed with a gold 15. Plus some green accents for GPU components. The back of the shirt has a subscriber graph starting in 2008 when we launched the website, and it moves towards 2 million now. Grab one of these shirts before they're gone and support our interviews with experts like this one by going to store.gamersnexus.net. Considering one of NVIDIA's marketing slides from its initial announcement was talking about what percentage of gamers play at 1080p, it's no surprise that they then focused on 1080p, but the card is $400, and just to remind everyone before you're gaslit into believing something else, NVIDIA was marketing the GTX 1060 for high-quality 1080p gaming. The GTX 1060 came out in 2016. So there's a little bit of a sliding scale here, or actually more appropriately, there's moving goalposts, where resolution was once the thing that drove sales of the high end. In order to push high end, say, 1080 Ti or 20 series sales, the move was towards not just RT at the time, which wasn't established yet, but rather 4K gaming when rasterized. And that's especially true for something like the 1080 Ti. But as RT has pushed into the market, and more appropriately, as game developers have become lax in optimization for some of the titles that are coming out today, the resolution argument has fallen off, and instead the focus shifts to anything else that looks more favorable. That is no longer NVIDIA's focus, and that's fine, but it still has to scale. It's okay for the technological focus to shift to some other graphics technology that's more relevant or more interesting or whatever, but that needs to be defended sensibly. And the 3060 Ti, equating the 4060 Ti in some of these scenarios, or the two having barely enough of a gap to justify anything more than overclocking your 3060 Ti, that's the problem. And AV1 and DLSS3 are basically the only things that prop up the 40 series 60 SKU as being even a new generation. It would deceptively look like the past generation otherwise. So this is an embarrassingly impotent GPU, and we're putting a lot of the conclusion today up front because the conclusion is very straightforward. And once again, we don't want to waste anyone's time. We'll have all the charts to support that though. But in the news video, we're not going to go back into depth again. In the news video, we covered the details of the changes. We covered NVIDIA's arguments for them, presented them neutrally, objectively. Now we get to test those. But the main thing was the 128-bit memory interface. And typically you'd see something like 2 times that width, if not more, at this price class. So NVIDIA's focus then being on lower resolutions might make sense. And we started with the focus on 1080p in the charts you're about to see, but we shifted that to front-loading 1440 and 4K because realistically, 1440 is probably what you're expecting to play at this price class, and the FPS does support it. But the more interesting thing to us technologically was, as an academic study, how does the scaling behave between these resolutions? Because we became suspicious based on some of the things that NVIDIA said. Okay, we're gonna get into the testing. So competing cards to think about. The 6700 XT, at least as of writing and filming, is available for around $320 at the lower end of the price stack, up to $350. So that's very competitive against the $400 8GB 4060 Ti. There's a $500 4060 Ti 16GB coming out in July. There's a 4060 non-Ti coming out in July, $300. But the 16GB, nothing changes except for the memory capacity. And in instances where the memory itself is not the limitation, and there are instances where memory was a limitation, we'll show some footage now of Control at 4K where the textures were failing to load on the 4060 Ti, and that was a capacity problem. But in instances where that's not the limit, the issue is the power is still not going to be there to drive the performance. The 6800 XT, very interesting, $500 to $550 right now on average. Seems like it's running low on supply, but that will be the competitor to the 16GB 4060 Ti. The 7600 is rumored to be about $300. The A750 is like $250 now. The 6600 XT, $255. These are lower price options. They're not going to compete in performance with the 4060 Ti, but that gives you the landscape of the market. And then above it, it's the 4070, whose MSRP was $600, but maybe it's starting to come down. Anyway, it launched at $600, it's 50% higher than the 4060 Ti's launch price. So the performance will not scale with that price hike. But let's get into the charts. In Total War Warhammer 3 at 1080p, the RTX 4060 Ti 8GB card ran at 129 FPS average, with lows at 96 and 71. This has the $600 4070, priced 50% higher, running about 35% ahead. The prior 3060 Ti ran at 120 FPS average, establishing only an 8% lead for the 4060 Ti over the 3060 Ti. This truly is revolutionary. You actually couldn't get this much generation to generation consistency if you tried. NVIDIA's performance here is phenomenal. Very impressive. They were able to flatline a card from 60 to 60 and show an improvement that basically amounts to noise. You could overclock a card and get 8%. Even another 8GB of video memory can't save this GPU. Its impotence is insurmountable from simply VRAM. It needs much more than that. Intel Arc in that chart, meanwhile, is sitting on these charts wondering where its price competitors have been for the past year. It's finally gotten some, but they're mostly older cards. The 6700 XT is regularly $320 to $350 on Newegg right now, brand new, making the 4060 Ti 25% more expensive, but only also 8% higher in performance. The value is not good. At 1440p, the 4060 Ti really shows up strong. It's 2.68% better than the 3060 Ti. Not 2.67%, certainly not 2.69%, but 2.68. Now that's impressive. And again, it's hard to get some of these games to be consistent within 2.68%, let alone nail it an entire generational leap apart. The 6800 XT outperforms the 4060 Ti by a staggering 41%, and that's available for around $500 to $530 now, or the same price as the future 16GB 4060 Ti. And now we are learning the power of memory bandwidth and bus width, despite NVIDIA's cache boost, something that they focused on heavily in our interview where we previously detailed NVIDIA's answers to why some of these changes. Despite that boost, the scaling just gets worse as the resolution increases, and this is just an insult at this point. Like, 1080p gaming was a thing that we targeted 6, 7, 8, probably 8. It's about 8 years ago with much cheaper cards, and this one is already failing to scale at 1440. But let's take it up one more run. There was a time when these companies were pushing for 4K on $400 cards. But we have to keep moving that goalpost, otherwise people won't need to buy new cards. Game developers, fortunately, can help with that by not optimizing anything. But in this instance, 4K serves as an academic study. The RTX 4060 Ti ran at an academically low 38.8 FPS average, making it actually worse than the 3060 Ti. This is just embarrassing. This is basically error, to be fair, but basically error is a terrible place to be for a generational change. Not a good look for NVIDIA, and we're seeing the limitations of bus width at play. Cache increase or not, this just isn't good enough. The last data point is so important that we're going to switch focus to validating it. The 3060 Ti matching or potentially outperforming the 4060 Ti at 4K is deeply concerning. There are some corporate words that NVIDIA should understand. And so we're front-loading the 4K test now for this train wreck, the words that the audience will understand. In Rainbow Six Siege, which I think we all agree should be able to play 4K on a $400 video card, the game ran at 126 FPS average on the 4060 Ti. In an absolute sense, okay, it's playable. In a relative sense, compared to the 3060 Ti's 121 FPS average, and with 1% lows being the same between them, that's once again just straight up embarrassing. This card may very well be dead on arrival and the worst card that NVIDIA has produced in years. That's about a 4% improvement generationally. Same price or not. We're in Intel Skylake on Skylake on Skylake levels of limp product. The 6800 XT posts far higher performance and should probably be grabbed prior to the 4060 Ti 16GB launching at the same price. At 1440p, the 4060 Ti posted a 261 FPS average with lows well spaced and timed behind it, so at least it's consistent there. It is, however, also consistent in being an embarrassing letdown. The 4070 is about 31% ahead, despite a 50% price increase, and the 3060 Ti now allows the 4060 Ti a lead of 5%, so that's great. It's gotten 1 percentage point better at 1440p. Surely this justifies its existence to someone somewhere. We're at waste of sand levels of bad and rapidly descending. Soon it will be just a waste of molecules. At 1080p, the RTX 4060 Ti should unembarrass itself just a little bit. That's a new word, by the way, unembarrass. We're coining it here, kind of like how NVIDIA coined unlaunch not long ago. The 4060 Ti's 421 FPS average is only 1 FPS higher than what you'd have to be using to conceive of this product. The result has it at 7.5% better than the 3060 Ti. That's 2.5 percentage points increase. Or, if you work for NVIDIA's marketing department, you could call it a 50% increase. It's math, marketing math. This result has the 4070 maintaining a familiar spacing. The 6700 XT is encroaching on the 4060 Ti, but not as much as the 3060 Ti in this game. It's, once again, incredibly unexciting, and they'd have been better off just making more 3060 Ti's, but that's not really a great outcome either. Time to continue, now with a newer game. In Cyberpunk 2077 at 4K, NVIDIA makes a miraculous recovery, one that parallels only No Man's Sky, and it lays claim to an impressive, staggering 5.4% improvement over the 3060 Ti. This is actually like, this is actually unbelievable. Like bad. We were worried for the first half of this review, but that worry has been quelled. They've done it. They've made the worst $400 generational improvement ever to launch in this industry. The 4070 only posts an 11% improvement over the 4060 Ti here, allowing disproportionate leads on other hardware north of these 40 series cards at the quote-unquote low end for peasants and poors who can't wear a leather jacket everywhere. The 6800 XT pulls a 23% lead over the 4060 Ti 8GB card, perhaps threatening the later same-priced 16GB model. Just kidding, it's not perhaps, definitely threatening it. But don't worry, we still have 1440p to lean on, a resolution that NVIDIA boasted being able to run on its same-priced cards from the Pascal generation. The RTX 4060 Ti ran at 66 FPS average here, leading the 3060 Ti by 6.5%. One of the biggest increases we've seen all review. The 4070 leaps 28% ahead, so that's a big jump from its prior hindrance. This generation seems disproportionately poor in 4K performance and to some extent 1440. Maybe that's why NVIDIA is pushing DLSS and RT so hard. They need to get people running the lower true pixel counts to play to the strengths of the architecture. At 1080p, the 4060 Ti's 106 FPS average puts it just ahead of the 6700 XT. The lead over the 3060 Ti grows to 9.8%. Maybe that's the trick to all of this. The scaling here suggests that if we just drop the resolution to 360p, maybe 144p, it might be in territory where we see reasonable generational gains. But right now, this truly is. It's reliving Haswell into Skylake. And if you were there, you know how boring that was until Intel had a competitor again. This is bizarre. It's the newest high-end 144p gaming card. Get your Quake and Unreal tournaments ready. Here we go. Back to the chart. The 6800 XT's 140 FPS average posts a compelling option in the $500 price class, even with the impending $500 4060 Ti that no one is going to care about after this one. There's not much else to say here. They've relaunched the 3060 Ti. We haven't found the worth yet, so we're going to go into the shadows of tombs to continue to not find it. In Tomb Raider at 4K, the 4060 Ti's performance posted good frame time pacing, so that's a positive. The 1% and 0.1% lows are performing as expected. But the 66 FPS average has it once again shockingly bad in positioning against NVIDIA's own prior products. If this thing didn't have AV1, we wouldn't believe it's even Ada architecture. It seems like they actually just released a refresh of the 3060 Ti and clocked it up. We're talking about 3 FPS here. This is ridiculous. We could do that by spending 15 minutes overclocking or like putting it under an air conditioning unit or something. Intel Arc has been below this price class alone for months now, and even its A750, a card now sub $300, is within 30% of the 4060 Ti. NVIDIA is contributing to one of the best marketing campaigns that Intel could hope for. After the melting X3D CPUs and this disastrous launch, all Intel has to do is stay quiet and its products will sell themselves.
Thanks, Steve.
At 1440p, the 126 FPS average performance lifts the 4060 Ti to be about 12% ahead of the 3060 Ti. That's at least closer to NVIDIA's own first-party embarrassing claim of 15% headroom. No wonder they were so shy about pushing it and pushing DLSS 3 so hard. This card's only advantage is that the 30 series doesn't support DLSS 3, but not every game has DLSS 3 support, and not every gamer wants to use it anyway. The 6700 XT technically leads the 4060 Ti here as well, and the 6800 XT posts a big enough lead to be secure against the inbound 4060 Ti 16GB. Finally, at 1080p, the 4060 Ti starts to show where it does kind of better. We wouldn't call it doing well, but we'd at least classify it as not so embarrassing as to question sanity. It's our new award. We'll post it on a website or something. The 4060 Ti's 187 FPS average has it 17% ahead of the 3060 Ti. That's still product refresh territory for an improvement, except this is a new architecture. It's kind of like a 3065 Ti or something, but this one is at least less catastrophically brand credibility imploding than some of the previous results. Everything from 225 FPS and up is hitting a hard limit. So you can ignore those entries. They mean nothing. Just like the 4060 Ti. Because NVIDIA came to this review equipped with a shovel, we decided to use it to dig GTA 5 out of the grave before putting this one in it. We only ran at 4K because we thought a game from 2015 from 2013 would be too light to run at 1440p. We were wrong, evidently, because the 4060 Ti sat firmly at 72.9 FPS average. This older title, combined with 4K, produced a shockingly poor results for NVIDIA. The 3060 Ti's 77 FPS average is 5.9% ahead of the 4060 Ti. That's just awful. We thought it was wrong, we looked into it, and it wasn't. It's just probably this bus problem once again. The lows aren't even any different between these, so the top of this chart is CPU bound, but certainly the 4060 Ti is not. After that expedition to the graveyard, it's time to enter NVIDIA's final fantasy of a product worth considering and look at Endwalker. In this test at 4K, the 4060 Ti ran at 64 FPS average with lows not particularly good, but also not disproportionately bad from the rest of these results. The A770 encroaches on NVIDIA's spot hard here, and in a way that's concerning for NVIDIA. It's cheaper, it has the most gas left in the tank when it comes to driver improvements, Nice, that was an unintended pun. And NVIDIA has already exhausted its driver tricks with how mature its cards are. The 3060 Ti is within error of the 4060 Ti. Not a surprise at this point, sadly. The 6800 XT, meanwhile, proves worthy of consideration once again. At 1440p, the scaling is at least favorable enough to push the 4060 Ti back in front of the 3060 Ti. The memory bus was hurting it at 4K, and the 4060 Ti moves to about 6.4% lead over the 3060 Ti, so this is getting predictable. Let's just move on. The frame cap at 1080p is bound by the CPU. It ends up being about 225 FPS average. We removed all the other cards bound by that. The 4060 Ti is up there, but it retains its 6% lead over the 3060 Ti. We were hoping to see a little bit more scaling here, but not this time. We're going to move quickly now. F1 2022 at 4K had the 4060 Ti at 74 FPS average, which is 6% ahead of the 3060 Ti, so they at least look better here than in some of the previous results. The 6700 XT is just ahead of the 4060 Ti at 4K, with the 4070 once again about 33% ahead. At 1440p, the 4060 Ti ran at 133 FPS average, which had it 9.7% ahead of the 3060 Ti. Finally, we're starting to find NVIDIA's claims of uplift. The 6700 XT maintains a lead, now reduced to 3% though. At 1080p, which is the resolution that this disgrace was marketed for, the 4060 Ti is again about 9% ahead of the 3060 Ti, which actually is just bad. It didn't keep scaling. So once again, you could overclock a 3060 Ti and split the difference or achieve it. Let's do one more set of rasterization just to prove the point. Just to have enough games in here, because the beatings will continue until the benchmarks improve. In Horizon Zero Dawn at 4K, the 4060 Ti ran at 59 FPS average, with the 3060 Ti slightly ahead. We've shown this in enough games to prove the point that 4K is just hard for the 4060 Ti to prove its worth, which is severely disappointing, seeing as NVIDIA was pushing for 4K at points not distant from this one not many years ago. In fact, these numbers have been so unexpected that our lab technicians on this review, Jeremy and Patrick, marked the results as suspicious for me to look at. We reran the tests to ensure it wasn't test error, and it kept coming up the same. At 1440p, the 4060 Ti outpaces the 3060 Ti by a staggering 1.1 FPS average. Remarkable. They've done it. We can all go home. This is it. It's the pinnacle of the mid-range. Time to move on to ray tracing benchmarks. With ray trace shadows enabled for Tomb Raider and first at 1080p, the 4060 Ti slightly redeems itself with an 18% boost over the 3060 Ti when tested in a proper like-for-like scenario with RT enabled on both. Based on NVIDIA's claims, that's the number we'd want to see in all of these scenarios, but it's not in all of them. That's the problem. The 6800 XT's lead is 19% here, with the 4070 still reliably 33% ahead. At 1440p, the 4060 Ti ran at 75 FPS average, leading the 6700 XT this time by 11%. The 3060 Ti's 65 FPS reduces the 4060 Ti's lead to 15% from its prior 18% lead, which follows a known trend. The only reason we're showing this at 4K is because it's like a train wreck you can't look away from. The lead is now only 8% over the 3060 Ti. We're back to where we started. It's not about the absolute numbers, but about the relative numbers. The lead continues to reduce with resolution increases. The 6800 XT now climbs to a staggering 40% lead, with the 4070 at 50% ahead from 33% previously. The bus appears to matter more than NVIDIA was letting on. Moving on to control, NVIDIA's once flagship poster child RT title, the 4060 Ti's 75 FPS average result and its lows put it as basically tied with the 3060 Ti. There's a gap of about 3.3% here. Now, control is pretty rough on the memory bus. This is something we're going to talk about more in a moment because there's some texture loading issues. And being harder on the memory bus maybe shows why the gap is really not that big at 1080p. The 6800 XT holds a 24% lead, threatening the incoming 4060 Ti 16GB. One important note, although the 6600 XT is present here, it does not have sufficient memory performance to load all the textures. The other 8GB cards were not necessarily problematic at 1080p, but they were at higher resolution. 1440p is basically the same. The 60 Ti's are within 1 FPS. Moving on. We won't bother showing the chart from 4K, but here's some footage. The 4060 Ti was incapable of loading the textures properly at 4K. And if he played for long enough at 1440, we suspect it would also be a problem. Now, this isn't just the bus, but in fact is VRAM capacity. Its performance is bad enough that this is acceptable behavior considering RT's presence, just as an FPS number. However, we wanted to point it out because although it is quote-unquote acceptable in the sense of, well, RT is on and it's pretty heavy and it's 4K, it's a VRAM problem. Unfortunately, a 24 FPS result with unloaded textures won't support even a 16GB card in this game, and unloaded textures means it might influence the frame rate in a positive direction anyway. It might load textures next time, but with 16GB and no other changes on the next 4060 Ti, it still won't perform enough to matter in this particular game. Ray tracing for F1 at 1080p had the 4060 Ti at 83 FPS average, which is a 14% lead over the 3060 Ti. That's much more normal, but still not really convincing. The trend continues where NVIDIA's newer card may be advantaged in RT, but even still, 14% isn't enough to be particularly exciting. At least this one didn't have texture issues or VRAM capacity issues though. And now we move to Cyberpunk with ray tracing at 1080p. We're using DLSS and FSR technologies here. Intel and AMD are on FSR, NVIDIA is using DLSS 2. Scaling is in the chart header and is like for like. The 4060 Ti ran at 97 FPS average, leading the 3060 Ti by 18% with a like-for-like DLSS setting. To see more DLSS 3 impact, you can see our prior Cyberpunk RT Overdrive content. The 6800 XT now falls behind, with the 79 XT and XTX leads also shrinking. In this scenario, NVIDIA is advantaged in general. Our thermal chart features a 30-minute Port Royal loop. This allows the GPU to hit steady-state thermals. So that allows us to evaluate the cooler performance, the frequency behavior, the fan response, and how it does with a sustained load. For thermals, the GPU core in this chart ended up averaging at around 62 to 65 degrees Celsius in a controlled 21 degrees Celsius environment. The GPU hotspot was more variable, ranging from 70 to 76 degrees Celsius. These numbers are okay. The delta from core to hotspot is about 10 degrees on average, which is better than typical for GPU coolers, at least for the ones that we used to get. This indicates that NVIDIA has established even pressure distribution and contact between its GPU cold plate, which we'll look at in the teardown posting later today, and the GPU die itself. This specific aspect of cooling is something that NVIDIA has been working at. You can stack as much copper as you want, but if it's ineffectively leveraged and it doesn't make good contact, it doesn't really matter. Partners could learn from this focus, and it's something that some of them picked up on, but not all of them, and maximizing pressure distribution will better leverage designs. The 4070 FE, just as reference point, ran similar deltas but with an increased baseline temperature of about 3 to 5 degrees. Briefly looking at fan RPM, the card ramps from 0 to 1500 RPM almost instantaneously once the load starts. It's not really much latency or hysteresis there. The noise type and the noise level are therefore relatively consistent once the load is established. Next up is a frequency validation plot to make sure things are working properly. We zoom this scale in to make the differences more visible, and the RTX 4060 Ti held about a 2760 MHz clock throughout the entire test. There were really no drops in frequency here other than a couple blips, and no decay from thermal soak. That's one of the main things we look for, is if the cooler starts to get overrun. The RTX 4080 ran at 2780 MHz on average, with the 4090 fluctuating more between 2700 and 2780. Power testing is up now. The new RTX 4060 Ti should be a low power consumer compared to previous generations, and that follows a couple of NVIDIA's recent trajectories. One of them is the relative performance to price trajectory, where the expensive mid-range cards have only gone down in relative performance to price, so it kind of makes sense that the power consumption is also going down because we're shuffling the whole stack down in the naming department. The 4060 Ti pulled about 165 watts in a full torture workload with a power virus, so that's the worst case scenario. That has it below the prior 3060 Ti by about 40 watts and about 30 watts higher than the RX 6600. The RTX 4070 ran at 200 watts for the same workload, or a 20% increase in power consumption, and we'll look for scalable performance gains to compare against that. Overclocking only added another 10 watts to the 4060 Ti, which is a massive disappointment and another demonstration of almost no overclocking headroom on a Founders Edition card. So at least this is an aspect that partners could improve on, and it's one where if they improved too much, maybe it would start sort of taking away an argument for an upsell to a higher end card. So the GPU is kind of embarrassing. The best argument here would be DLSS 3, which is the argument NVIDIA made and focused on, and now we understand why there was so much resistance when we said, why don't you just add another bar to the charts? where it's tested like for like DLSS 2 or no DLSS or whatever, but doing first-party benchmarks where it's DLSS 3 against the 3060 Ti with DLSS 2, it was misleading by our opinion. And NVIDIA disagrees with that, and that's fine. But it's not a like-for-like test, and that much is not disagreeable. There's a forced agreement there because it's fact. So DLSS 3, while yes, available on the 4060 Ti, is not sufficient to justify its existence in this capacity. It is a waste of sand. And in that way, we just can't recommend it. The prices are falling right now. It's really frustrating to see cards like this launch because it starts to become clear why the community has been saying, well, so the names are shifting. And although names are in some part arbitrary, and there was a time years ago that I more believed, well, the product name is arbitrary, who really cares about the performance? Over the past year, I'd say, we've posted a video where I wanted to detail on the 4080 being unlaunched why actually I now disagree with my own old statement. And that's because although the names are in one aspect arbitrary, it is, as we've mentioned before, a death of the author scenario where it is not arbitrary to the buyer. And that's what matters. That's the mindset that NVIDIA lacks, which is the name 4060 carries with it at least some level of expectation, some level of, although not as high as an 80 class, prestige. And it lacks that here. It behaves more like, say, a 4050. And launching a card that is functionally equivalent to, at times, up to 20% better than the last generation similarly named product at the same price, while, yes, noble NVIDIA, thank you for not increasing the price, it's just not good enough. And that's all we really have to say about this card. Maybe the 4060 will turn it around for NVIDIA. We don't really know. We'll have to test it. But the 16 gigabyte is unlikely to solve these problems. It will solve the issue of textures not loading in games like Control, which are more memory intensive in terms of capacity. It will not solve raw throughput problems because it doesn't change the compute capabilities. So that's it for this one. I check back soon. We'll probably have an RX 7600 review. That's supposed to launch pretty soon as well, according to the rumors. And otherwise, subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to support this type of coverage directly. We're cramming all of this testing and filming in right before our flight for a couple of weeks in Taipei to cover Computex, which is a massive, really fun trade show with a lot of new computer hardware added. And we won't really be covering GPUs that much, so you'll probably like it. Check it out. But we'll see you all next time.